What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we're going to talk about the kind of most recent flare-up, some of the historical antecedents behind it, and we're going to talk about kind of why this conflict is just as much about race and class as it is about religion and politics. So, as most people know, over the past few weeks, there has been kind of a recent flare-up in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, this is a conflict that has been raging for almost a century, ever since the kind of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. And after the recent attacks by Hamas, where they fired about 1,500 rockets into Israeli territory, most of these rockets were shot down by the Israeli air defense system, but there were about 8 casualties. So 8 Israelis did die from these attacks. They were killed from these attacks, most of them being civilians. But in response, the Israeli kind of defense forces led a huge bombardment of Palestinian territory, in which 119 Palestinians were killed in Gaza alone, including 10 Hamas leaders and 31 children, and injured more than 800, and that was as of Friday. And today they put out another article talking about how 33 people were just recently killed in another Israeli airstrike that flattened 3 buildings in the Gaza Strip. So the death toll is now well above 150, and obviously thousands have been injured. Now, as this article points out, Israel's U.S.-built F-16 jets and artillery systems have struck at least 150 targets across the impoverished enclave, home to 2 million Palestinians, and leveled 3 high-rise buildings with links to Hamas. So right here, they're pointing out that all of the U.S. Or all of the Israeli armed forces or armaments that are being used to attack Palestine are mostly provided to them by the U.S. government. And for decades, billions of dollars in American military aid has been going to Israel and has been justified as necessary to help an underdog nation stave off an array of powerful foes threatening its survival. In one memorable case, when Israeli defenses were harshly tested in 1973, so this was in the Battle of Golan Heights, by a coordinated attack from Syria and Egypt, the U.S. airlifted jets and fighter tanks to Israel to make up for its equipment losses. So they basically stepped up and helped defend Israel against the oppression or the armies of Syria and Egypt. But as of now, Israel demonstrates its ability to inflict a lopsided death count on the Palestinians. It's time to acknowledge that this depiction of Israel no longer has any basis in reality. Instead, U.S. aid merely polishes the armor of a regional Goliath in its contest with David. And right now, the U.S. provides about $3.8 billion to Israel annually, which makes up about 20% of Israel's defense budget. So, and nearly three-fifths of U.S. foreign military aid globally. So, putting this into perspective, they show you how basically two of Israel's neighbors are receiving only 1.3 billion and 350 million in aid as part of policies intended to ensure their peaceful relations with the Jewish state. While Israel is required to spend most of the aid money on military equipment made by U.S. companies, in turn, Washington is required not to sell weapons to other Middle Eastern countries that are more sophisticated than those possessed by Israelis, guarantee its qualitative military edge. So basically, this just proves right here why, this alliance system has created this power base in the region in which Israel is getting the best, only the best from the U.S., and no other power in the region is able to buy those same weapons. So it creates this kind of military dominance by Israel, which is allowing them to basically dominate and further occupy territory in Palestine. So one of the things that this kind of, looks at, and what a lot of conspiracy, especially in the Muslim community, people will talk about, is that this kind of smells like the Greater Israel Project, or this kind of old conspiracy that Israel was trying to expand its borders to kind of this to encompass the old borders of King David's kingdom. So this would stretch from kind of the eastern borders of Egypt, northern Saudi Arabia, western Iraq, most of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan would all become part of Israel under this kind of plan if it was to come to reality. And there's been a lot of conspiracies from, the different lobbying groups in Washington saying how like the American Israel Political Action Committee and the Project for the New American Century, PNAC, are both organizations that have been kind of supporting and pushing for kind of more support for Israeli kind of occupation in the region, or at least supporting Israel's military expansion. So, I'm not saying that this is reality. I'm just saying that this is something you need to understand when you're looking at these conflicts, because you need to understand kind of the rhetoric on both sides, and you need to understand kind of what people think about why Israel's trying to expand their territory, right? They're like, it seems like this is kind of the goal, and the overall goal is to kind of to expand into these regions. And you'll see that if you go watch my video when I talk about the kind of war on Iran, the U.S. war on Iran, I talk about how Saudi Arabia is kind of the main Sunni power broker in the region, and the Sunni kind of forces in Iraq neighboring regions are basically looking to Saudi Arabia for guidance. And the fact that the U.S. Is basically arming Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia and Israel are the two biggest receivers of military aid in the region, it creates this kind of power brokered alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel against the Shiite nations of Iran and Syria, and obviously the Shiite people that are existing within Iraq, but also the kind of Sunni people that are not willing to kind of ally with Saudi Arabia, right? They're not willing to kind of accept the kind of, I guess, ultimate power, or the overall kind of hierarchy that puts Saudi Arabia as the ultimate kind of leaders of the Islamic religion. So this is kind of a war between kind of religious entities, but at the end it really comes down to power, right? It really comes down to territory, power, and control. But this is obviously something that is more important when you're talking about the Muslim kind of factions in the Shiite-Sunnite division. So if you want to go learn more about that, go watch my video that I made on the U.S. kind of war with Iran and the kind of further backing of Saudi Arabia and looking to kind of encroach and expand their kind of power into the Shiite regions of the Middle East. So that's kind of what is happening with Saudi Arabia. You could say it's even a greater Saudi Arabia project, where they're trying to expand their territory kind of into Iraq and into Iran, even Syria. Whereas, you could see this basically as just an alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel trying to expand their territory and encompassing basically the whole Middle East, being an alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and then the U.S., right? And if you want to understand kind of the reasons for why the U.S. backs Israel, and why I said earlier there's this kind of idea that race is just as much important in this conflict as religion is. And that's because when you start to understand the region, you'll start to understand that many Palestinians are actually Jewish, and there are actually many people living in Palestine that, when Israel was created as a nation, that were Jewish, and there are tons of Jewish people around the world that are not white or that are not European. And there's been this kind of division for a long time between kind of European Ashkenazim Jews and those that would be called Hasidic Jews, or the traditional kind of Sephardic Jews. There's kind of been a warring of cultures between these two groups. And this is a good article here if you really want to kind of understand the differences between the groups, right? This article kind of talks about the varying different Jewish groups and kind of where they get a lot of their ancestry from. So this Mizrahi Jews are kind of an interesting factor because they are from a Middle Eastern ancestry. So these are Jews that don't necessarily look white, right? They look more like Palestinians, right? They're not from Europe. And that's the thing about a lot of people nowadays, is they don't really understand the fact that Ashkenazim Jews are kind of the main power bases in the Israeli community. So, you know, you have these different factions that obviously come together to form kind of, you know, the Jewish community. But in terms of who's in power, you'll find that a lot of the people that are in power in Israel are Ashkenazim Jews, and they're not Sephardic Jews. And a lot of the people that oppose kind of the Zionist expansion or the kind of encroachment into Palestinian territory and the kind of constant conflicts with the Palestinians are generally the Sephardic and the Mizrahi Jews, right? So, you know, in this article they talk about how a lot of these Ashkenazim Jews were kind of formed in Northern Europe, and they kind of, you know, from Poland and throughout kind of these Ukrainian, Belarus, different Northern European kingdoms, they created this kind of different cultures, this Talmudic scholarship. In 18th century Germany, the Haskalah movement advocated for modernization, introducing the modern denominations and institutions of secular Jewish culture. Although the first American Jews were Sephardic, today Ashkenazim are the most populous ethnic group in North America. The modern religious denominations developed in Ashkenazic countries, and therefore most North American synagogues use the Ashkenazic liturgy. So basically what this is saying is that most Jews in North America today are of the Ashkenazim, and this is why they are basically white, or they look white, whereas like most of the Jews living in the Middle East, or, you know, in Turkey or in other places in North America, or Northern Africa, you're going to find that they're generally not white. These people are the Mizrahi, they're the Sephardics, right? They're more darker skinned, right? And the one thing you want to take away from all of these different Jewish communities and groups that make up the Jewish religion is that Judaism is a very diverse community. It's not just Ashkenazim European Jews that make up the kind of leading groups in Israel that are able to get support from North American kind of Christians and different Jewish communities. It's really a multi-ethnic community that exists throughout the world. And today you have a very, very misconception. You have this big misconception that Jews are only living in Israel and only living in like North America, and that there's not Jews living in places like Palestine, places like Lebanon, places like Egypt, right? Iran, Iraq. There are still thousands and thousands, if not millions, of Jews living in these regions, and a lot of these people oppose the state of Israel and what they're doing. And this is why I say that a lot of times it's just as much about race as it is about class. And a lot of these different aims, you're going to find that there's a lot of people, especially Sephardic and Hasidic Jews, that oppose the state of Israel. And this interview here kind of will give you an understanding of why that is, if you want to go take a look at it. But basically the Neturei Karta is a Hasidic Jewish organization that opposes Zionism. They oppose the state of Israel, and they claim that the state of Israel is actually against the traditions in the Torah. And when the Almighty himself had banished the Israelites from the state of Israel to the four corners of the world because of their different forms of idolatry and their kind of forsaking the one God, this was their punishment. And because of this, they were not allowed to have a state of Israel. And this is why the Hasidic Jews believe that today the modern state of Israel is actually against the wishes of Yahweh, or of God. And this is why many of these different Hasidic organizations vehemently oppose the state of Israel and what they're doing to the Palestinian people. And this is something that, if you really want to understand, there's dozens and dozens of these rallies in different peoples, different communities that are kind of promoting these different anti-Zionist actions and rhetoric. So these people were actually, these will actually stand at Israeli rallies. So as they're kind of having a parade for Israel, these Hasidic Jews will stand there and denounce the state of Israel. So it's just interesting. And I think a lot of times you have this kind of misconception from a lot of people that Jews are, only white living in Europe and Israel in North America, and they're not living throughout the rest of the world. There's not Jews in Palestine and in Jordan and in Iran and Iraq that are basically being targeted by Israel. So it's one of those things that I think is something that the Western world really needs to understand. It really needs to come to grasp with. It really needs to kind of understand that Judaism is a multi-ethnic religious organization. It's not just an organization that is based around the state of Israel, in that a large portion of Jews around the world don't actually support the state of Israel, but many of them do, obviously, and that's 100% fine. And obviously, I'm not saying the state of Israel doesn't need to exist, because it definitely should exist, as long as it doesn't want to oppress others and try to expand its territory and basically create genocide and ethnic cleansing on other peoples just so they can expand their territory. This is what I'm against. I'm not against the state of Israel in itself. So very briefly, I'm just going to go over the historic connections between the kind of Zionist movement and the Protestant elites in Europe. So we have to go all the way back to the Protestant Reformation of Martin Luther, when he rebelled against the Catholic Church and basically put up his theses on the church door at Worms, which said that the Bible needs to be translated into individual languages and not only spoken and written in Latin. And this is because he wanted individual believers to be able to interpret for themselves the Word of God, rather than rely on Latin priests or the Latin Church to be the only controllers of the language of God. And this is why you had kind of a massive revolt against Catholic rule at this time by many of these Northern European kingdoms that wanted to kind of promote this new Protestant religion. So Germany, Holland, some areas in Poland, and even in France started to take up this Protestant banner and kind of resist the kind of overarching hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Now, this was responded to by the Counter-Reformation, in which the Catholic Church created, after the Council of Trent, they created the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits, and various other organizations that main goal was to bring back the Protestants into the Catholic fold. And they were to do this through however any means necessary, be it conversion, be it military action, or manipulation, whatever. Basically, just do anything to get these people back into the Catholic fold. And Charles V was kind of the main. He was the main kind of person that the Pope put in charge of this mission. And at the time, Spain was probably the largest Catholic nation, the strongest Catholic nation in Europe. And prior to the Counter-Reformation, which happened in the 16th century, so you had the work or the efforts by the Spanish state to reconquer the southern portions of the Iberian Peninsula that were still controlled by the Moors. So basically, this was a Muslim people that had conquered the Iberian Peninsula centuries earlier, and they had finally been pushed out by the Spanish in the late 1400s. And at this time, you had kind of this urge for religious unity at the same time. So not only were they pushing out the Muslims, but they were also looking inward and saying, we want to have a unified Spanish people. And this led to a persecution of Jews throughout the kingdom. And at the time, Spain had the largest Jewish population in Europe. And this led to a massive movement known as the Spanish Inquisition. And this was a, persecution of Jews, as you see this depiction of a Jew standing trial before the Grand Inquisitioner, Thomas Torquemada. And this led to the burning at the stake and the slaughtering you could call it ethnic cleansing of thousands of Jews throughout Europe. But you also had kind of this outcome where those that were able to fled. So those that were able to get out of Spain and Southern Europe to flee to Northern Europe, so they fled to Holland, they fled to Germany, they fled to these new nations that were Protestant and that were no longer ruled by Catholic law, and this enabled them to kind of get out of the Spanish Inquisition, or at least not be persecuted as heavily as they were in Spain. So those that didn't flee ended up converting to the Catholic Church and became Christians, that were known as conversos or Moranos, and these were essentially Jews that became Christian by necessity, and outwardly they would go to Catholic Mass, they would wear Catholic garb, but inwardly they would hold secret synagogues, and they were very much still practicing Judaism, but they had to put out an outward look of Christian. And so this is what created this kind of persecution in Europe, and what led towards this fleeing from Spain, which, like I said, had the largest Jewish population in Europe, made them flee to Germany, to Holland, and eventually to England. And this is kind of the beginnings of this alliance, right? Because what ended up happening is that a lot of these people in Spain were actually very, very high. They weren't elites, but they were very, very high members of society. They were bankers. They were politicians. They were workers, artisans. These are people that were not nobodies. They weren't living in ghettos. They were very well connected, very, very well funded people in organizations. And what ended up happening is that these people realized that they had no hope, trying to get back into Spain or trying to bring back, to re-allow Jews into Spain. So they started to focus on these new kind of Protestant nations like Germany, like Holland, and like England, and they started to gain much support for their not only religious organizations, but they're also for their kind of puritanical views, which became adopted by many different Protestant organizations and Protestant movements throughout Europe. And it's an interesting connection when you start to look at the connection between like Puritan different Christian organizations and like the puritanical Jewish kind of garb, and how they were very similar in the way they dressed and in the way they kind of looked at the Catholics, right? So this is what you need to understand when you want to understand kind of all the way back to this early connection between kind of these Protestant European, or we would call them Ashkenazim Jews, right, and the different Protestant elites or organizations or countries, nations in the Western world, right? So that's that. Hopefully you guys kind of understood what I was saying there. If you have any questions about that, feel free to leave it in the comments below. So here is just kind of an overview of the HRW report. So this is Human Rights Watch. So this is one of the biggest non-government organizations that looks at kind of ethnic cleansing, looks at different war crimes, and they are non-governmental organizations. So these aren't Muslims, these aren't people from the West. These are people that are not associated with anybody. They're kind of going in with a fresh perspective, and they're saying, look, we're not on any side. We're just telling you what's happening, right? We just want to tell you what is happening. And you can read this report yourself. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically what they say in this is how basically Israel has expanded their territory exponentially over the past few years, and they're doing it without any resistance from the West or from any other people other than the Muslim communities, right? Other than the people that they're invading, other than the people that they're oppressing, and the people that they're ethnic cleansing. Nobody else is really talking about this. And there was actually a really interesting article by Al Jazeera put out the other day talking about how CBC and has basically refused to talk about it, right? They basically are denying that this is happening, right? They're basically, not only are they not reporting on it, but they're refusing to even acknowledge it, right? And many of these different organizations have actually sent in these different findings to the different Canadian broadcasting corporations and Western media sources, trying to get them to say, hey, why don't you guys talk about this? Why isn't this something that's big in your media? And obviously, like online, we're seeing a lot of stuff. But on one of the days, last week when this was happening, instead of CBC talking about what's happening in Palestine, they basically were talking about President Obama's water dog that died, and they did a whole headline story on CBC for that, and they didn't even mention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's kind of how our mainstream media news is going today. And I know many people will say, well, maybe it's not as it's not as important or whatever. I don't know what they would argue, but whatever they would argue, they would try and say something like, Israel's just defending themselves or whatever, so we don't need to cover it, or it's such a ongoing conflict that really it has no bearing in to talk about it in the news, because it's always happening. But I'm not going to go over this article too much, but you can read it and you can see that, like, obviously it's Al Jazeera, so obviously they're going to be a little more biased against Israel, but at the same time, this just is the reality. When you talk about, like I said, why was the HRW report not covered, right? Why was it not covered? And why every time, why are they not even responding to it, right? Like this person says here, to try to answer that question, I approached 17 hosts of the CBC's most popular news and current affairs programs with several queries via email to explain their individual and collective failure to inform, enlighten, and allow Canadians, including scores of able and willing Palestinian Canadians, to reflect publicly on HRW's report from April 27 onwards. None of these suddenly mute journalists turned TV and radio personalities who ask questions for a living responded. Not one. Instead, they shunted me to a CBC PR official. Their sad hypocrisy is on clear dishonorable display. So, this is one journalist to another journalist asking, like, hey, why aren't you guys covering this? Why aren't you guys even talking about this report that a non-governmental organization that obviously, is putting tons of research and tons of time into studying what's happening in this region, and nothing, right? And they have dozens of maps and different, actual research, like actual documentation to prove to you that this is happening. And this is happening all at a time when, COVID and the world's in a pandemic and whatever's happening. But at the same time, while we're all distracted by all this, Israel just constantly is expanding their territory into Palestinian and ethnically cleansing Palestinians at a rate that is expanding exponentially. And really, like, with this Hamas attack, right, it just shows you the reality, right? Like, the attack was shot down. Wasn't even 8 people died, but the extent of the retribution is thousands injured, hundreds dead, probably hundreds more dead now, entire blocks leveled, entire communities destroyed. And like I said, you think, like, the biggest problem is Hamas is seen as, like, representing Palestine, but they don't. They represent a small group of people that are discontented with what's happening. And don't get me wrong, maybe the people of Palestine are behind them, but it's not like the Palestinian people decide to launch those rockets, right? It's an individual organization that is deciding to do this, and you blame an entire people, right? And it's just, that's how ethnic cleansing starts, right? It's like, this one little group does this little incident, and then we blame the entire portion of them, right? And they all have to be killed, right, because of it. And it's so sad. But the other thing is why I say this is more about race, just as much as it's about race as it's about religion, is when you understand that there's tons of Jews living in Palestine, these Mizrahi Jews that live in Palestine and throughout the Middle East, you'll understand that much of what's happening is a political and a racial cleansing in order to promote the agenda, the Zionist agenda of the Greater Israel Project. Now, is that just a conspiracy? Maybe. But if their constant ethnic cleansing and their constant expansion into Palestinian territory is not ever questioned, or is not ever, if it just continues, what are we going to see, right? And this is kind of the other thing I was just talking about, right? This is the kind of other thing about this racial kind of cleansing that's happening, is it's not just a cleansing of people through physical force. It's a cleansing also through international and kind of optics, right? It's more than just a physical war. It is a war on the people as well, internationally, in the Western media, right? And this is kind of that. Paints a great picture, right? Is that these Israeli people that are seen as white are able to do anything. They're able to go anywhere. They're able to become Israeli citizens. They're able to move out and visit wherever they want. Whereas these people that are born looking Palestinian, and they both might be Jews, right, have none of these rights and are denied and are basically persecuted in the Western media as the initiators of this conflict, right? Or the bad ones, right? Whereas they're doing nothing but defending themselves and being oppressed at every step. So I don't know. That's going to be it for this video. I know it was kind of long. I know I talked a lot about things that I don't know necessarily that you guys will understand, but I'm just trying to give you guys a full context for this history, because it is important that you guys understand all of these different aspects. It's not just a conflict that's happening between Hamas and Israel. It's a conflict that's happening on a larger scale, that's happening, between Jewish groups, not just between Jews and Muslims as well. So this is what we need to understand. And we need to understand that the U.S. support for Israel is more than just a happy alliance. It is more than that. And it is a movement for power in the region. Like I said, if you look at what they're doing with Saudi Arabia and how they're backing Saudi Arabia in the region, if you go watch that video that I did in the U.S. war in Iran, when I talk about how Joe Biden reacted and droned those people in Syria because of the actions of Iran, you're going to understand that this is all meant to keep people in line, to show you that, hey, we are the power broker in the region. The U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, we are the power. We rule this region, and we are going to expand our territory against anybody. And we're going to destabilize the region in order for our different power bases to expand, or in order to destabilize our enemies. And those people that we want to kind of overtake, we will neutralize them through media, or through literally by dividing the country up, and by creating these factions, by pitting Sunni against Shia, by kind of creating these proxy wars and these proxy armies. It is done in a way that is meant to promote the power of the Western world and of Israel and Saudi Arabia through their kind of Sunni Jewish Judaism alliance. But like I said, it's not really about religion. It's about race, it's about class, and it's about power. But the first two are more important because they tell a story that is being neglected throughout the mainstream media. And that is that those that are seen as white are seen as right in the Middle East. And that's wrong. But that's the way it is, unfortunately. And if you want to look at this report, HRW, Israeli Authorities, and the Crime Against the Palestinians, it's a really good report. it's really, there's a lot of information in here. I really encourage you guys to read it. Go over it. Like I said, our media is not. So definitely the Canadian media is not talking about it. The U.S., maybe some independent news organizations are talking about it, but the mainstream media is not. And yeah, it's just a reality. But that's why we need to talk about it. That's why we need to make these videos, to expose the truth and expose kind of the lies that are more typically than not the ones that we see as reality, or that we're told is reality from our corporate overlords. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Like I said, feel free to like and subscribe. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I plan to make some more. I can, really want to talk about stuff like this, but it's hard for me sometimes because I don't know, I don't get a ton of support in these videos. So I want to try to make more, and I want to talk about subjects like this. I want to try and do like a weekly recap, where at the end of the video I do like I talk about what happened that week, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, hopefully you guys like the video, and hopefully you guys understand a little bit more about what's happening in Israel at this time. And yeah, that's gonna be it. Have a good day, guys.